Imagine a world where the concept of love does not exist, and the only reality you have ever known is surrounded by high-voltage barbed wire. This is not a dystopian fiction novel, but the terrifying reality for those born inside the political prison camps of North Korea. For decades, the outside world remained largely ignorant of the atrocities committed within these hidden gulags, where generations of families are imprisoned for the alleged crimes of their ancestors. Among the thousands of prisoners, one young man named Shin Dong Hyuk was born inside the fences of Camp 14, and he was destined to die there without ever seeing the outside world or understanding what freedom meant. Camp 14 is located in the district of Kicheon and is known as a total control zone, where prisoners are considered irredeemable and worked until death. The camp spans nearly 60 square miles of mountainous terrain and is patrolled by armed guards who view the inmates as less than human. Inside this brutal environment, the prisoners are forced into hard labor in coal mines and factories for up to 15 hours a day, with barely enough food to survive. The diet consists mostly of corn gruel and cabbage soup, leaving the inmates in a constant state of malnutrition and desperation, where catching a rat to eat is considered a feast. The social structure within the camp is built on a rigid caste system that pits prisoner against prisoner to ensure total obedience. Trust is a foreign concept in a place where snitching on friends or family is rewarded with extra food rations or lighter work duties. Children born in the camp are taught from a young age that they are sinners because of the actions of their parents or grandparents, and that their only path to redemption is through hard labor. This psychological conditioning creates a twisted morality where betrayal is a survival mechanism and empathy is a dangerous weakness. Shin Dong Hyuk was born in 1982 as a result of a reward marriage allowed by the prison guards between two model prisoners. Unlike children in the free world, Shin did not grow up with bedtime stories or warm embraces from his parents. His relationship with his mother was cold and transactional, as they competed for the same meager resources to stay alive. He viewed his mother not as a protector, but often as a rival for food, and his father was a distant figure whom he rarely saw. This lack of familial bond would play a tragic role in the events that would later haunt his life. Education in the camp consisted of memorizing the rules of the prison and learning to be obedient workers for the state. The teachers were actually guards who wore uniforms and carried sidearms into the classroom ready to punish any student who stepped out of line. Shin recalls witnessing a teacher beat a classmate to death simply for hoarding a few kernels of corn in her pocket. This level of violence was normalized to the point where the children watched the beating with little emotion, as they had been desensitized to death and suffering since birth. As Shin grew older, he was indoctrinated with the belief that the outside world was a terrible place, filled with enemies of the state. He knew nothing of television or the internet, or even the geography of his own country, beyond the electric fences. His entire universe was the gray landscape of the camp and the constant gnawing of hunger in his stomach. The prisoners were told that they were lucky to be under the protection of the camp authorities, and that leaving would result in immediate death or worse. The turning point in the life of Shin Dong Hyuk began with a conversation he overheard between his mother and his brother. Shin was 13 years old when he heard them whispering about a plan to escape the camp and flee to the outside world. In any other society, a son might try to help his family or beg them not to go, but Shin had been raised in a world where reporting rule breakers was the highest form of duty. He feared that if their plan was discovered, and he had not reported it, he would be punished alongside them. Driven by the camp indoctrination and a desperate desire for food reward, Shin made the fateful decision to inform a guard about the escape plan. He believed he was doing the right thing according to the laws of the camp and hoped to be praised for his loyalty. However, the guards did not praise him immediately, but instead they arrested him and threw him into a secret underground torture facility. The guards suspected that Shin was also part of the escape plot, and they wanted to extract a confession from him through brutal means. For days, Shin was subjected to unspeakable torture as the guards suspended him from the ceiling by his ankles and lowered him over a charcoal fire. The burns on his back would leave permanent scars that served as a physical reminder of the cruelty he endured. Despite the pain, Shin maintained his innocence and insisted that he was the one who had reported the plan. Eventually, the guards verified his story, but the trauma of the torture chamber shattered whatever innocence he had left. The guards eventually released Shin from the underground prison, but forced him to watch the public execution of his mother and brother. He stood in the front row of a crowd of prisoners as his brother was tied to a wooden stake and shot by a firing squad. Then he watched as his mother was hanged. At the time, Shin felt anger toward his mother for planning the escape that led to his torture. But as the years passed, that anger would turn into a crushing guilt that fueled his desire to survive. After the execution, Shin returned to the general prison population, but he was now treated as an outcast by the other prisoners who knew he had snitched. He was assigned to hard labor in a pig farm and later in a garment factory, where he worked long hours under dangerous conditions. The isolation he felt was profound, as he had no friends and no family left to rely on. He existed in a state of numbness, focusing only on his daily quota and the next bowl of corn gruel. Years passed, and Shin entered his early 20s, still living the same monotonous and brutal existence within Camp 14. It was during this time that he met a new prisoner named Park Yang-chul, who had been transferred to the camp from the outside world. Park was a well-traveled man who had lived in Pyongyang and even studied abroad in Europe before his arrest. This meeting would change everything for Shin, as Park was the first person to tell him stories about the world beyond the fences. Park described a world where people could eat as much pork and chicken as they wanted, and where they could travel freely without guards. For Shin, the concept of freedom was abstract and difficult to grasp, but the descriptions of food ignited a fire in his imagination. He became obsessed with the idea of eating roasted meat and white rice. Park and Shin formed a secret friendship and began to plot an escape, not for the sake of liberty, but for the promise of a full stomach. The two men spent months whispering their plans while working in the factory, carefully observing the movements of the guards. They decided that their best chance would be during the winter months, when the prisoners were sent to the mountains to collect firewood. The terrain was rugged, and the guard patrols were slightly less concentrated in the dense forests near the perimeter fence. They knew the risks were absolute, as getting caught meant immediate public execution. On the day of the escape, Shin and Park were working near the electric fence that marked the boundary of their world. They waited for a gap in the patrol schedule when the guards were distracted or out of sight. The fence was a formidable barrier, consisting of high-voltage wires and barbed wire, intended to kill anyone who touched it. Shin and Park knew they had only seconds to act before they were spotted by the guard towers. Park was the first to attempt the crossing, and he threw himself against the bottom of the fence, trying to squeeze through a small gap between the wires. Tragically, the electric current was too strong, and Park was electrocuted instantly, his body seizing up and becoming entangled in the high-voltage wires. He died within seconds, acting as a human shield against the lethal current. Shin watched in horror as his friend perished right before his eyes. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, Shin knew he could not turn back now. He used the body of his friend as an insulator and crawled over Park to get through the fence. Shin suffered severe electrical burns on his legs as he scrambled through the wires, but he managed to make it to the other side. He landed in the snow on the free side of the fence, terrified and in agony but alive. He was the first person known to have been born in a North Korean prison camp to escape. Shin ran into the snowy wilderness, not knowing where he was going or how to navigate the outside world. He was wearing a prison uniform and was emaciated, which made him an obvious target for anyone who saw him. He broke into a nearby farmer's shed and found old military clothing which he used to replace his gray prison rags. This disguise allowed him to blend in slightly better, although his malnutrition and scars were still visible. For weeks, Shin traveled north toward the Chinese border, relying on his survival instincts and stealing food to stay alive. He had no map and no money, but he followed the direction of the rivers, hoping they would lead him to the border. He encountered North Korean civilians along the way and was shocked to see that even outside the camp, people were poor and hungry, though not as desperate as the prisoners. The journey was fraught with danger, as military checkpoints were common and Shin had no identification papers. He used his wits to avoid soldiers and often walked at night to minimize the risk of capture. The physical pain from his burns and the cold winter weather made every step a struggle, but the memory of the camp and the fear of return kept him moving forward. He knew that capture meant a fate worse than death. Finally, Shin reached the Tumen River, which serves as the border between North Korea and China. The river was frozen in parts, but guarded by soldiers on both sides. Shin waited for a moment when the guards were not looking and made a desperate dash across the ice. He slipped and fell, but scrambled to the Chinese bank of the river. When he set foot on Chinese soil, he had officially escaped the jurisdiction of the North Korean regime. In China, Shin lived as a fugitive, constantly afraid of being arrested and deported back to North Korea. He worked odd jobs for food and eventually made contact with a journalist who helped him navigate the complex underground railroad for defectors. He eventually made his way to the South Korean embassy in Shanghai, where he sought asylum. The officials were stunned by his story, as they had never encountered a defector who was born inside a prison camp. After arriving in South Korea, Shin underwent intense questioning by intelligence officials who needed to verify his identity. His knowledge of the camp, lay out the names of the guards, and the scars on his body provided undeniable proof of his origins. He was eventually released into South Korean society, where he faced the massive challenge of adjusting to a modern world he did not understand. Simple tasks like using a debit card or buying a bus ticket were overwhelming for him. The psychological scars ran deeper than the physical ones, as Shin struggled with nightmares and post-traumatic stress disorder. He was haunted by the memory of his mother and brother and the guilt of his role in their deaths. He had to learn how to feel emotions that had been suppressed for his entire life, such as love and compassion. The transition from a prisoner to a free man was a slow and painful process that required years of therapy and support. Shin eventually decided to share his story with the world, to shine a light on the human rights abuses happening in North Korea. He published a memoir titled Escape from Camp 14, which became an international bestseller and brought global attention to the hidden gulags. He traveled to the United States and Europe to speak before the United Nations and meet with world leaders. His testimony was instrumental in the establishment of a UN Commission of Inquiry. The story of Shin Dong Hyuk forced the international community to confront the reality of the North Korean prison system. Satellite imagery confirmed the existence of Camp 14 and the locations Shin described, including the mines and the execution grounds. His detailed accounts provided the most comprehensive evidence of the systematic torture and starvation used by the regime to control its population. However, the journey of truth is rarely a straight line, and years later Shin admitted that some details of his story had been altered. He clarified that he had spent time in a different camp nearby, and that the timeline of his torture was slightly different than originally stated. He explained that the trauma was so severe that he had tried to distance himself from certain painful memories. Despite these adjustments, the core of his suffering and the reality of the camps remained undisputed. The admission of these discrepancies sparked a debate about the reliability of defector testimony, but human rights experts stood by Shin. They argued that trauma often fragments memory, and that the physical evidence on his body and the satellite corroboration proved the essential truth of his experience. Shin apologized to his supporters, but continued his advocacy work, knowing that millions were still suffering behind the fences. Today, Shin Dong Hyuk lives with the physical and emotional scars of his past, but he is free. He has married and started a family of his own, trying to give his children the love and security he never had. His story serves as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unquenchable desire for freedom. It forces us to ask difficult questions about our responsibility to those who are suffering in silence. The legacy of the escape from Camp 14 is not just a story of survival, but a call to action for the world. It reminds us that in the 21st century, there are still places where human beings are treated as property and where children are born into slavery. As we look at the satellite images of the camps, we must remember that each pixel represents a human life waiting for a chance to be free. The incredible escape of Shin Dong Hyuk ensures that their stories can no longer be ignored.